In this video, I'll be talking to you about rhetorical modes. Now, I'm sure you've heard of these things before. In fact, given the course you're in, you've probably even had to write with them before. This presentation is going to have to do with the fact that we'll be looking at the function of rhetorical modes in one specific way, having to do with the way that our course works. So, again, tune in for a specific understanding of modes, not the same old thing you've probably heard in previous courses. Now, first, I want to make it clear we use rhetorical modes because of the way that they allow us to use examples. Examples really are the bread and butter of academic writing. We have to be able to construct those things in specific and meaningful ways. And then we need to be able to use them in, again, specific and meaningful ways, given the context that we're working within. Now, it's through narration and description that we build examples. We narrate them in specific ways, we describe them in specific ways. The decisions that we make are all down to exactly what we're aiming to be able to demonstrate, show, or otherwise help our reader to understand in regards to the examples that we use. Now, looking at the ways that individual rhetorical modes use those examples, process analysis uses examples as steps, stages, or points in a process or within a concept. Illustration and exemplification uses examples as supporting details. Cause and effect uses examples as events and or outcomes. Comparison and contrast uses examples as specific ways in which two or more things are similar to or different from each other. Definition or redefinition, and we'll talk about why it is you've got the re there, uses examples as elements of context, which give a word or idea a specific meaning. Finally, classification uses examples as items that are categorized and analyzed. When it comes to choosing and using rhetorical modes, that choice comes down to a combination of a number of things. I've got 5 of those here, but this isn't an exhaustive list. Those things include the writer's purpose, the subject matter to be written about, the final form that the writing will take, an awareness of reader or reading audience, and finally, the within academic writing, an understanding of the assignment itself. If we decide to use narrative, we have to remember that first, the main idea is a point about the events that we include within the narrative. This is telling a story, and it's probably the most familiar. The narrative is tied to the beginnings of language itself. It all comes down to our ability to communicate individual events or certain sets of events to other people and to be able to derive meaning from those sets of events. Grammatically, all language begins as a story. The language might take the form of subject and verb, in other words, someone does something, or subject, verb, and object, someone does something to someone else. Again, at the very basis, these are the two ways that full ideas are constructed. And what that means for us is that language is all based on very simple narrative. Again, we're talking about something that is done by or to someone. Now, this is a fundamental appeal to a reading audience. There really is no other way of developing ideas that has the potential to relate to other people that narrative does. However, if it's used as part of an essay, again, it must have or make a point. A narrative that doesn't is a point that's not made, and it results in a reader who doesn't know why they're reading what they're reading. When used as a paragraph of an essay to develop a single point, the narrative needs to have straightforward narration, chronological order always. We need to address who, what, where, and when as quickly as possible. We leave why and how up to the reader to ascertain themselves based on the details included in the narrative. We limit to only what has to be there. And finally, we make sure to always use concrete details. Moving on to description, and this is the second way that we assemble the examples that we then use in other ways of writing. The main idea of a descriptive point or paragraph is a dominant impression of what's being described. In other words, the main way that we react to the thing being described somehow. So we're describing something, and this is going to come down to two different kinds of details. There are objective details, and those are the ones which we all understand in basically the same way. This is a factual accounting of things, and sensory details, the way that something looks, smells, tastes, feels, the way that something can be perceived by not just us, but anybody who looks at it and otherwise confronts it in the same way. On the other hand, there are subjective details. These are details which each of us understands in a different way. These are the big ideas: love, right, wrong, purity, evil, right? Those big ideas that maybe we have some amount of agreement upon, but there's also a whole lot of difference based on who you are and the sum total of your experiences. Now, again, if we're using sensory details, these apply to the five senses: sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. Usage of these sensory details is the best way to keep a descriptive audience rooted in objective description and concrete detail. We also might use simile and metaphor, and I'm sure you've heard of these things before, but just as a way of touching upon how we develop description, I'm going to mention them again. A simile is a comparison between two things, relating them to each other using like or as, such as pure as the new fallen snow. And I am, of course, sitting here writing this presentation just after a snowfall. After that, we have metaphor, comparison between things, relating them by saying that one simply is the other. And here our example is: her mind was a steel trap, and what she studied never escaped it. A description aims to paint a picture, so to speak, of what is being described in the mind of the reading audience. A spatial relationship or organization generally makes the most sense. This could be top to bottom to top, left to right, right to left, interior to exterior, exterior to interior, and so on and so forth. The spatial organization one uses is going to be up to exactly what it is that we're working to say through the description, or the dominant impression that we're working to convey. Moving along, the first of the rhetorical modes that makes use of the examples that we construct is process analysis. The main idea of a process analysis is the way that individual stages or steps relate to a final outcome or process as a whole. It could be process instructions or a process explanation of some kind. Process instructions are the ways of explaining to someone how to accomplish a task. This is second person perspective. This is a direct address to the reading audience. Think of these things like instructions. Whereas, on the other hand, if we have process explanations, this has to do with how a final outcome is reached somehow. This is a third person perspective. In other words, we're not talking to anyone in particular. Instead, we're looking at the things themselves, and it's more about the process than about the audience. So then, a process analysis is essentially the story of how something happens. It follows chronological order, and the descriptions of individual stages or steps follow the same rules as descriptive writing itself. But there you can see that we've got narration and description there within the way that we put the steps or stages or points together, and then also in the way that we assemble those things so that they all make sense in some point that we're making. Following that, we have illustration and exemplification, the main idea of which is actually pretty simple. It's how the details of the writing support the main assertion or thesis statement of the essay. To illustrate is to show something through evidence. To exemplify is to show something through examples. Though, like I've said previously in this video, really it's all examples and just a question of what we're doing with them. Effective usage of illustration and exemplification means supporting details are chosen based on audience, topic, purpose, assignment, the best possible information, and in the case of research, the most authoritative resources. In other words, if we're doing research writing, our examples have to come from the places where we know the best information is coming from. Now, order and purpose interact when we ask, how does your purpose dictate how to structure the writing? We could explain the history of an event or topic, and this would be chronological. We could tell a story or relate an experience, again, chronological. We could explain how to do or make something, chronological, explain the steps in a process, chronological as well. However, there are other ways of going about doing this. We could decide that we're trying to help a reading audience see something as we want them to, and that would generally take a spatial organization. We could work to create a dominant impression using a sensory detail. And again, that would give over to spatial organization or order. Finally, if we're trying to persuade or convince, organizing our details in order of importance would work well. The same is true of working to establish a hierarchy of items. In other words, talking about items in a particular order that has to do with their individual significance, but also the way that they relate to each other. Again, there we would use order of importance as a way of making sure that not just the selection of information, but also the organization of that information works to show the reader exactly what it is that we're working to do with that development of details. Following up, we have cause and effect. And for academic writing, this is sort of the holy grail. We're always trying to show that something clearly causes something else. The main idea is, therefore, an exploration of the link between cause and effect. We're always trying to show that something is causing something else, right? So we've got the two things, but the link is what we're trying to establish. Sometimes establishing the existence and nature of this link means more emphasis on cause or effect rather than evenly developing both. Generally, we're trying to show that causes in particular are related to effects, or that effects are somehow related to causes we have. Or finally, we may be trying to show that some causes are linked to their effects by one or more intermediate stages, right? But again, we're choosing which parts of this that we're focusing on based on what we have to accomplish. We develop this through order of importance, and we have to ask again, what is it we're trying to establish? Are we trying to show possible effects, possible causes, outcomes, short term outcomes, long term outcomes, effects on some people, effects on many people, etc.? And again, I think you're probably starting to notice at this point that it is all down to what we're trying to establish and accomplish in the writing. The main idea next of comparison and contrast, again, a way of writing that I'm sure you've been exposed to before, is to show that two or more things are predominantly similar or that two or more things are predominantly different. A compare and contrast essay or paragraph that shows that there are just as many similarities as differences doesn't really do much for us. We're never really out to show that. Instead, we're making a certain argument about which of the two of them is more significant, the similarities or the differences. The main idea must be significant given the objects that are compared and or contrasted. And the first example of this is the one that I'm sure we're all familiar with, apples and oranges, right? This is what we say when the differences between things are clear. We say it because the differences are clear without the need for further exploration. It, sort of gives itself over to anyone who looks at the two of these things that they are clearly different objects, and the differences are the defining characteristics. Whereas, say that we were looking at two different cars in the same price range with similar options, but from different manufacturers. Well, these are similar in some ways, different in others, requiring of compare and contrast exploration for that reason. We need to decide which is more useful given the specific situation of the buyer writer and given the mixture of ways in which they're similar and ways in which they're different. Right, but in that case, neither one, these similarities nor the differences, are so clear on the face of it that they obviously win out. Now, there are two structures we could use for this. We could go structure and organization by way of subject, where we would have a thesis, and then the main organization of the development after that would be the first subject, points one, two, three, etc. Second subject, corresponding points one, two, three, etc. And then the conclusion of whatever it is we're writing. Alternatively, we could organize by point of comparison. And in that case, again, we'd start with a thesis statement or main idea, and and then the organization of the description would go by the points of comparison. So, right? So point one, subject one versus subject two. Point two, subject one versus subject two. Point three, subject one versus subject two, conclude. Right. So as you can see from this, it's a combination of the same things. We're just sort of changing that combination around based on how we feel we're best going to be able to show what we have to. Next, definition, and I've got that RE in parentheses here. Now, the re is there because honestly, whenever we're using definition, we're not just presenting an accepted definition. Instead, we're offering up a definition of our own that fits our needs, that fits the situation, the context, that is somehow a very, very particular take on something based on what we require. That's where that re comes from. We're taking something and redefining it based on our needs. So then, the main idea is always how a term is defined in a specific way, in a specific context, to suit the needs of the writer and the writing. The dictionary definition is therefore Never the most relevant one because it's broad enough to suit lots of different manners and contexts and purposes and readers. You've all seen dictionary definitions, although honestly, we might as well call them Google definitions now because that's how we're looking things up. Either way, they're structured in a way where pretty much whoever you are, the definition is something that you would understand and agree with. That's just fine. But if we're doing a piece of writing, the context is always far more specific. We're never writing for anyone who could possibly read something. We've always got to have a better understanding of exactly who it is that we're working to suit through the writing that we produce. Defining the most important terms to be used is essential in an expository essay and incredibly powerful in a persuasive essay, right? So, again, we've always got to have a clear understanding of what our terms are. The question is, are we defining those for our own purposes, or can we actually make some progress towards proving a point of our own, given the definition of them? Now, we begin by identifying context, the who, what, where, when of the situation. The elements that dictate the specific way that the definition needs to work are these. We start by establishing why and how, and this will have a lot to do with the purpose of the writing. The definition or redefinition of the writing must fit into the situation and work to explore the how and why of it. Right. So that's the way that the definition is going to work towards the analytical ends of the way that we develop it. Next, we have classification. And the main idea of this is a little bit longer, but given the way the classification works, I think you understand why. The main idea is always the manner in which breaking broad subjects down into more specific parts by way of dividing them into categories helps us to understand both the subjects and the smaller, more specific parts. The thesis statement of such an essay or paragraph usually explains and relates categories and subcategories, presents a rationale for them, and the way that the subject has been broken down into smaller, more specific parts. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but think about the sorts of things you might classify. Take breakfast cereals, for example. The way that you decide to come up with categories for those is going to be based largely on your own purposes. I could divide those into gluten-free versus gluten-containing because my own household, excuse me, it has to be gluten-free, and that would be pretty straightforward. I would simply be dividing those into two different categories based on whether or not they are gluten-containing. On the other hand, say that I have children who will only eat breakfast cereals that have chocolate components in them of some kind. I might start by breaking those things up into two categories, chocolate containing and chocolate not. But even after that, we could look further into the chocolate containing category and break it up into smaller subcategories. How much chocolate? What kind is it? Is it chunks? Is it something else? Right. So again, what that means is that the topic, in other words, the thing that we're categorizing, and the subtopics, the category that we fit those things into, or set of categories, plus the rationale for how we come up with that set of categories, that gives us the main idea that we're working to develop in a classification piece of writing. In the end, then, just like the title of the presentation reads, we're looking at these things as tools. And bear in mind that tools are only important to the extent that they help us to achieve our goals or reach our ends. If, hypothetically, and this is pardon me, a sort of a metaphorical example of the importance of understanding how one tool relates to another, if all we have is a screw, a hammer won't work, nor would a wrench, saw, socket, etc., etc. Even after that, though, we would need to identify what the kind of screwdriver is that is necessary. We have to identify what size of screwdriver is necessary. We have to know whether we can use the screw with the screwdriver we possess to produce the necessary mechanical outcome, right? Anyone who's ever done any sort of DIY project knows the best way to get a good outcome there is to make sure that we're always using exactly the tools that fit the need. So some of the rhetorical modes could and are used on their own for strictly their own ends. It's much more likely that you use a combination of these for what you write, given your purpose, audience, subject matter, assignment, the main idea of the essay. Right, going forward, what you'll find is even if you've written whole essays that were descriptive, whole essays that were narrative, really for the sorts of essays that you'll be doing, it's more likely that all of these things will be used in something of a mixture based on the way that individual points have to be developed. So then, if we need to make a point about the significance of events, we narrate. If we need to convey a dominant impression of something, we describe. If we need to explain how something must be done or must happen, we use process analysis. If we need to use evidence to support a larger point, we use illustration and exemplification. If we need to link events and outcomes, we use cause and effect. If we need to show that two or more things are mainly similar or mainly different, we use comparison and contrast. If we need to show how a particular meaning of an idea, term, or object is important, we use definition. And lastly, to break a broad subject down into more meaningful specific parts, we use classification. That finishes our discussion of rhetorical modes here. I hope that you've done the reading, which has a lot of the same information. That's what this presentation is based on, but also much more. So please don't just look at this, take a look at the reading as well. It's got a lot of additional development having to do with the individual modes that simply isn't contained here. Thank you all for watching this video, and I'll talk to you soon.